Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here today and welcome to the Growth Labs Development Talk. I am LaChaun Banks. I am the Director for Equity and Inclusion at the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative and at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance. It's my great pleasure to welcome today Carel Kleynhans, South African property developer and CEO of Divercity Urban Property Group. He's worked closely with the Growth Lab during their 2-year engagement in South Africa, focused on diagnosing the causes of South Africa's economic challenges and working to include more South Africans in the process of economic growth. So we are so excited to hear from him today.
Thank you, LaChaun. And how's it, everybody? It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for taking a bit of the time out of your schedules to I guess, hear what I have to say. I think Alexia was the first victim, at least of HKS, of my incessant talking about this topic. So when we met in South Africa, when was it? Probably over a year ago. It was clear that there was immediately a lot of, I guess, common interest in this issue that I'd like to share a little bit about today. And it's really, for me, a pleasure to be able to continue having a receptive audience, at least I hope, around this. So, and thank you, LaChaun, as well for facilitating the discussion. Maybe I'll just stand over here so you can all see the screen. I want to share with you just briefly a little bit about kind of what we do as a business and why we do it, really, and then really steer the conversation actually away from our direct work and more towards maybe a conversation around specifically the issue just in the abstract of inclusivity in cities and why it's such an important issue in my view. So as LaChaun mentioned in her introduction, we develop affordable housing in South Africa, really the asset class that would be called multifamily in the US, so essentially apartment buildings, but we try and do it in a slightly less horrible way to the norm, and I'll illustrate that visually for you in a moment, what I mean by that. And yeah, we've built about 7,000 apartments to date. We've got about 2,000 under construction as we stand today. Another 5,000 that will commence with construction in the next year. So we're quite busy. And really, we hope to just basically keep doing this and expanding. Not necessarily, like we certainly as a company can't solve the housing crisis of not even South Africa, never mind the broader kind of context within which we operate. But for us, the ultimate goal really is to demonstrate a commercially viable and scalable alternative to the current norm around typically spatially marginalizing patterns of affordable housing development. And we hope that if we can do a good enough job at that, that we can really inspire the private capital market to follow suit and really redirect a lot of the capital flows that are going to not so great things at the moment into better things in the simplest possible sense. So that's what we do. I just want to show these are literally probably not the best stats, but I got them on the train up this morning. So, so please bear with me. But just to illustrate the point that cities are mostly housing, this is stats from the US, from HUD stats, the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. And essentially what this shows is that 70% of built form in the States by area is residential. If you look at it in terms of count of buildings, over 90% of buildings in the States are ultimately residential dwellings. So the reality is that cities are mostly houses, very simply put. And this is just to show the equivalent statistic in South Africa. This is stats from our national kind of statistical office, I guess, around square meters of building plans approved by building type for these 2 years. This is not a little bit outdated, and you can clearly see the impact of the pandemic from 2019 to 2020 on building plan approvals. But I don't know if there isn't a little pointer here, but basically this is all residential, smaller houses, bigger houses, apartments, and then basically everything else. And as you can see, it's all housing, right? And the US, I mean, this like 70% stat over here, I think is indicative of obviously a very advanced economy where there is a lot more kind of commercial use outside of the residential sphere. This is really, I think, much more typical of an emerging market context. So obviously we've all heard this stat a million times, and people always quote it in different ways. And I always wonder when it's going to stop referencing 2050. So it's like, by 2050, so many people are really living in cities. And, I wonder if it's just going to stay that until like 2045. But anyway, it's at least for as long as I've remembered the year we always quote. But the point is that there's this massive urban-rural migration happening globally, especially in developing contexts, or at least that's where most of it still needs to happen. And essentially, if you think about it, in 20 or 30 or however many years into the future, the majority of urban form that will exist in the pretty near future doesn't exist today. And the point I want to make with these couple of slides combined is lots of urban forms still to be built in the next couple of decades. It's mostly in the developing world, meaning that it's mostly in markets where people have lower per capita spending ability, and it's going to be mostly residential. So by implication, it's an affordable housing problem. Right? The future of what our cities look like really is intimately linked to how we build affordable housing, just in the simplest possible sense. So this is something that's important to get right. And I want to talk you through why I think that is the case. This is actually the first thing I spoke. It's so interesting. What's pictured here is a housing development that I went to literally 2 hours before I met Alexia. So I'd had this thing in my diary that was set up by Keisha, actually, I think. Who introduced us? Yeah. So someone one of those people who, when they ask you to meet someone, you just say yes, because it's like someone who I really admire. And I must be honest, I actually had no idea what the meeting was about that we had. And I'd just earlier on that morning been out to this place, which is about an hour and 20 minutes drive from central Johannesburg, where I'm from. And this is an enormous 16,000 houses, new housing estate that's being built literally on an old farm that was just like rezoned to residential. The government at great expense installed bulk services infrastructure here, and this private developer is rolling out 16,000 houses in about 2,500 units a year here. This is like basically entry level housing in the South African context. These are typically low wage earning people working in low wage portions of the what do you call it, like administrative sector, like clerical workers, administrative staff, people working in retail, people working in the service economy. And these people all live at least an hour and 10 to an hour and 20 minutes commute from the city. And you would, if you're living here, you'd be spending probably about a third of your income on transport per month, right? This is a disaster. Not only for the people who live here, but certainly for our society as a whole. And I was very worked up about this when we met, which I think is perhaps why I was as animated as I was in our first kind of engagement. So I thought I'd just show a picture of that. This is kind of typically what this stuff looks like, just a bit closer. This is now in Cape Town, which is actually where I was born. You can see Table Mountain in the background there. And this is what's on what we call the Cape Flats. And it's just this, sprawling tundra of just like housing going out into the middle of nowhere, where we are effectively locking people into poverty, because once you're here, you basically can never get out. And this is government-funded public housing in South Africa. This is a project in South Sudan, just to show like these things happen kind of all over. And really, this typical form of urban development is basically the norm for housing development really all over Africa, right? Especially affordable housing development. So, and just this is a last picture. This is again Johannesburg. This is a slightly more established community, just to show like what this eventually looks like. So the typical form is that you get these, kind of like matchbox houses built like this, and then people over time fill it in a little bit and do densify to a degree with, backyard rental units that they build in. So like all of these little structures here, that's the first structure that was built by the government, and then all of this stuff is filled in by people over time. But even with that infill and further investment by the community into the neighborhood, the problem is you've started with a spatial form that can never be anything other than this, right? You've got small plot sizes. To build like an apartment building on here is impossible, because you'd need to do a land assembly through multiple owners. Often it's like intergenerational, title and ownership. It's basically impossible. So this will ever be, for pretty much for all practical purposes, be this forever. So why is this a bad thing? In the context of South Africa, South Africans spend, and this stat is actually understated, according to our most recent general household survey, South Africans spend on average 33% of their disposable income on transport, which is a complete loss. Like, you get nothing for that. You're spending 2 to 4 hours per day commuting to and from, where you need to go every day, whether that's work or where your kids go to school or where you buy your groceries. It's just an unbelievable loss for our society. You've got, there's an incredible environmental dimension to this, which I think would probably be obvious to most of you. And then also, we were speaking a lot about this earlier today, in terms of, fiscal policy. This is a huge challenge, especially for governments in emerging market contexts where, fiscal constraints are real. There's very well-established literature around the fact that and it's also just kind of like obvious, if you have more kilometers of roads that you need to build, or sewer lines you need to install, or electricity cables that you need to run, then it's just more expensive, right, than doing it in a more dense configuration. But it's not just in terms of the upfront infrastructure cost, it's also service delivery over that kind of sprawling urban form. It just costs more to run ambulances if you're running them like 20 miles out to get someone and back to the hospital, as opposed to like 2 blocks down. So in all these various ways, it's more like urban sprawl and sprawling kind of urban fabrics are much more expensive to maintain in the hands of the state. So, and then I like put the little UN SDGs logo here, which I'm sure many of you would have seen. It's basically a case of like, pick an SDG from a hat, and that kind of area of development that we all collectively agree is important is somehow impacted by urban form, whether it's gender outcomes or early childhood development or public health. All of these things intimately link into spatial form and the way in which our cities are arranged. So going back to the point I made right at the outset, all these cities yet to be built. What's going to be built there? Housing. It's going to be mostly lower wage, households, housing. So the point is, if you want to get all of this stuff right, you really need to start thinking about how to get housing right. So that's what we do as a business. So this is an image of one of our projects that Alexia and her team actually were able to visit. It's called Jewel City. The reason it's called Jewel City is this is in quite a central part of Johannesburg. It's actually where the diamond and precious metals trade of Johannesburg was kind of housed for many decades. It is an area that was in urban decline because a lot of the industries had moved out, and obviously the gold sector in South Africa has been in systemic decline for decades. And we acquired 7 city blocks immediately adjacent to one another from the former landlord, and redeveloped it into this kind of, I guess, neighborhood, really, that is, to us, really the blueprint of the alternative to this, right, that we are trying to demonstrate can be commercially viable to invest in. So what is here? This is 2,700 affordable rental apartments. For the cost of rent here, the way in which it's essentially priced to the consumer is that it costs the same to live in an apartment in this building, all in, as it would cost, or it's actually cheaper renting here than it would cost you to live out here, like 2 hours away. And that plus your cost of transport combined would be more than staying here. That's if you're one person staying alone. If you're 2 people sharing and both of you are doing the commute, then it stands to reason that it's significantly more affordable to live here. And that's, not to mention all the ancillary benefits that you're getting, because in this community, this building actually over here that you can't see very well is a primary school and a high school. We've got an 800 learner school there. We've got a primary healthcare clinic with doctors, nurses, physios, and dentists. We've got early childhood development center. We've got loads of kind of public space. This was quite recently after it was developed. All these trees are now like much bigger and well established. Loads of public greenery. There's loads of public art. All the kind of basic, amenities that you need, from a pharmacy to like your grocery store, restaurants, and everything. It's all there. And for guys like yourselves, I believe most of whom have had the benefit of probably growing up in a neighborhood or close to a neighborhood that's, perhaps similar to this in terms of access to amenities. It might not be that profound a thing, but for the average South African who lives here, this is like it's unthinkable to think that you could live in a place like this. We do a huge amount of surveying to our tenants, and ask them like what matters to you, and like why do you choose to live here, etc. And the feedback that we get almost without exception is that people who've grown up here never in their entire lives thought that they would be able to afford to be able to live somewhere that looks like this. It never even occurred to them. But from our perspective, and similarly, we talk to our capital partners who invest in us and fund this, and they say, well, how could you make it commercially viable to do this, right? Because there's this bullshit preconceived notion that poor people can't have nice things. And essentially, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is say, actually, guys, this makes a hell of a lot of commercial sense to do this, because we are building really, really high quality assets in the hands of our funders that are ultimately pension funds, because this thing will keep generating, like rental income for the next, couple centuries, really, if we do a good job at maintaining it. So I'm going to actually just skip on there. Oh, sorry, this is another one that we're doing at the moment. This is, I don't know if any of you have ever been to South Africa, but that's Sandton over there. That's kind of like I guess the largest, it's like the Manhattan of Africa, frankly. And this is like 800 meters down the road, 4,000 apartments that we're building there. This is just the first building that's going up there, about 10 buildings that look like this. They're going to be all over. And again, like this whole bottom level here is a big school, 4,500 learners. Again, like school and the clinic and all the basic things are going in. So yeah, basically that's what we're doing. But I want to skip on from what we do and return the conversation maybe just to why it's this question of why it's so important to really think critically about how we get urban form right, ultimately, if we want to achieve most of the, I think, goals that we collectively agree on are worth pursuing as a society. Cool. So that's me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carl, for giving us this great presentation. So I have a few questions here I'm going to start with. The first one is, so I teach racial equity and economic development, and I had a student a few years ago who was a space major. And I said, why do you want to take my economic development class? She said, I'm interested to see what it would be like to start a civilization or a society on Mars, which I thought was fascinating. But this goes directly to the vision of Divercity. You talk about your mission is getting cities right when it comes to building equitably and how this can create more economic prosperity and social equity in the areas. Talk a little bit more about what it means to get a city right from the beginning.
Thanks. I would love to meet this student of yours. Again, I don't think I don't have any profound insights around what a city that is right looks like, right? I think the kind of the basic theory around urban design is incredibly well established. I was telling Alexia earlier that I read a book by actually one of your faculty members here at Laser when I was a teenager, called Triumph of the City. And in that, I think it speaks very compellingly to the, I guess, urban economic benefits that arise from agglomeration economics. And I think, let's say in economic terms, like a city that is right is described well there. Another book that was written in the 60s by Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, I think describes very compellingly just like the kind of physical form of a city that works well. You've got streets where people look onto streets. You've got a certain amount of density. You've got like shorter blocks and activated street edges and like eyes on the street public space. The principles of urban design and what makes a city work well, I think, is very well understood and well established. But what we are not getting right is that understanding in theory isn't translating into the practical reality of the vast majority of urban form. And I think this is really the question of our time, is how do we get the theory that we understand so well to translate into reality? And I think for me, at least in the context in which I operate, getting it right means taking these principles that are well understood and incorporating them into space that caters for the average person and not just the elite few. Because there are some areas of South Africa that have like recently developed neighborhoods that are like lovely, like really, really nice. and that tick all the boxes of like good urban design and like, you know, kind of empowering space, etc. But it's for a complete like minority. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Recently, I've been hearing a lot of cities here in the States talk about the need to create more green space and canopy coverage in low income housing areas. We can date this back to redlining and when things were being built. How do you all tackle the environmental challenges as well as the affordability challenges?
Again, I think if you're getting density right, a lot of this it becomes a lot easier. So if I just quickly go back to this, you know, if this is what you're building, or even this, you know, just like the amount of trees that you'd need to plant here, which at the end of the day cost money, to make this like a genuinely green space is you know, kind of financially impossible. But you know, in Jewel City over here, we planted 400 trees, which sounds like a lot, but it isn't actually that many if you like, you know, consider it in the space that it occupies. But this is like an urban oasis now. But it was commercially viable because we've got 2,700 apartments in like that concentrated environment that effectively financially supported. So I do think density really is like, it's sorry that it's such a simple, but this is the great kind of like irony with this challenge, is that so many of the solutions are very obvious. You know, they're seemingly very obvious, but they're very hard to realize and practice. That's just around greenery and the degree, and that's obviously an important part of, I guess, the overall environmental sustainability of a neighborhood or of a city. But if I can digress for a moment, just briefly, on the topic of sustainability. So we did an interesting study with the Green Building Council of South Africa. It's actually some research that we commissioned and paid for and did it in partnership with them. And I'm sure many of you would know Arup, the global consulting engineering firm. But we got them to actually do quite a sophisticated life cycle carbon analysis on this type of urban residential development, being like dense and central, versus the other ones that was pictured. And just in terms of just looking at carbon as a dimension of sustainability, it's unbelievable, and again, quite obvious when you think about it, but it was quite amazing. I think the power of the work was to demonstrate it quantitatively and robustly quantitatively, that it's over the life cycle of a building, massively more carbon intensive to build the same unit, like the same residential unit out in the middle of nowhere, as opposed to in a centrally located area, because you effectively, by building that thing there, there's a path dependency around patterns of usage that you lock that user into, that they don't, I mean, there's like even like a choice dimension here, or like that I think is quite relevant. But yeah, basically, radically more sustainable to build dense urban form than building out in the middle of nowhere.
Great, thanks, Carl. Can you talk to us about what policies that are in place in South Africa that allow this project to happen and be successful? And are there overall policies that you think are crucial to developing equitably that you can share that others could maybe benefit from implementing?
Yeah, I could talk for hours to this question. So I think the honest truth is that everything we are doing as a business is kind of like in spite of the policy environment and not as a result of it. And I say this as someone who like, I thought that I was going into public policy as a student. This was like my kind of future path that I thought of after reading Ed's book. And then I realized that South Africa actually has amazingly progressive spatial policy on paper, but the problem is that it's not translating into practice. And I then became an investment banker. But really with the ultimate goal of kind of reapproaching the problem, but from the private capital market side, and that's what we're doing at the moment. So there is quite a lot that can be done through policy, I believe, but it just a simple spatial policy saying like we would like to have, you know, denser urban development isn't enough. The the challenge is that, and again, sorry to keep referencing our conversations of earlier, but we've had a very productive morning of conversations, so this is all top of mind for me. But the typical, my typical peer in the market, right, another developer building apartments for low-cost housing in South Africa, is rationally choosing to do something very different to this and the other market outcome that I showed you. Not because they're evil people or they like want to fuck the poor people with like building housing out there or whatever. They are just responding to a set of incentives as rational actors and doing what's like the kind of like the, given the context, the market outcome. We are choosing a much harder path because we've got a high pain threshold and make poor life decisions. But this is but this is not, I'd say, the thing that would result normally. So I do think that, you know, it's this like delicate balance between like how much do you want to use policy to constrain market outcomes and how much do you want to use policy to incentivize better market outcomes. I think my personal view is I think you need both. I do think you need to make it harder to build out there in the middle of nowhere through, for example, placing constraints on the ease of rezoning farmland into, you know, housing in the middle of nowhere, or perhaps through by, as a local authority, being less generous with installing roads and, you know, like, you know, bulk infrastructure like sewer and electricity for a developer that's, you know, ultimately building something that doesn't fit with your spatial policy. And this is a market failure in South Africa where we have, I guess, a weak public sector that is easily like lobbied. I mean, lobbying, I think, is a kind word. Like one might use the word like just like blunt corruption as well into outcomes that are not desirable. But sorry, it's not a very like precise answer. But the thing is, this is frankly something that I think clever guys like you should really try and work on. Is like, how does one, you know, get the policy space to result in better spatial outcomes? I don't actually quite know.
And it sounds like you're talking a lot about intentionality and how you are going against the grain, which, you know, that takes a decision to actually do that. So 10 years from now, what would success look like with your project?
I often think about this. I don't know. I really hope that it's not just us doing it, because I mean, like, yeah, so yes, like for whatever reason, like myself and my partners, and it's not really not just me, like I work with an amazing team of people that, you know, if anything, care more about this issue than I do. But the thing is, I really hope that we are not relying on the intentionality, to use your word, of a few, you know, for this to happen in a couple of years, but that one can get to a space where this is a more kind of automatic market outcome and not an exception. So what would it take to get there? I think that what we are, the primary thing that we are doing as a business is demonstrating that this is more commercially viable than the alternative. So if we, through a couple years of like solid investment performance, can demonstrate that this is actually just a better investment than the stuff out in the middle of nowhere, and it's more resilient to, you know, economic shocks, and it's the kind of thing that a pension fund would be better served to hold on their balance sheet than you know, housing that, you know, subprime, if anything, taught us is not worth much if people are willing to leave the keys in the door if it stops serving them. So so I think that will be one of our major contributions, is to show that this is, you know, a good thing to be doing with your capital as a capital allocator, right? But I hope that we can also use the work that we're doing as a platform to engage in conversations like this one that I'm grateful to have, and really start, you know, contributing to like the conversation around the policy space as well. And yeah, hopefully that will, basically, I'd really like to see more of this like massive chunk of urban expansion that still needs to happen in the next couple of decades not be horrible.
Great. I have one more question, then I'm going to open it up for questions. And I am going off script, Carl, so don't kill me, okay? You too, Alexia, don't kill me. This is exciting to see, but one of the first questions I thought of, is there education you have to do around folks going from like a single family house to now living in an apartment like this? And is there a lot of talk about the space? If someone has 3 kids versus living out in these what look like single family houses to moving here, is there a lot of education that needs to be done on this is different, or is it a lot of coercion to get folks to come, or is it just people flooding the gates saying we want to be in an area where we can have other amenities?
Um, I don't know. Honestly, I'm wondering if we could have a better outcome if we did more education, but the truth is that we don't really. We, again, I think there are a lot of preconceived ideas around, what the consumer would like to have. And I guess our experience is that, people are voting with their feet, here, in that, we're like absolutely at capacity, essentially permanently. And that to me is suggestive of the fact that clearly there is something there, like no one is being forced to live here. So like the fact that people so eagerly live there and pay rent, to me suggests that there's clearly like something in it for them that works. I don't know if this speaks to your question, but maybe just an observation. So we've got quite strict house rules, because obviously these are dense, buildings, and I guess we wrote our house rules thinking that this is going to be like really hard to enforce and ensure that people aren't like having a rave at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning and, this kind of thing. But interestingly, what we find is that we actually enforce, like we spend very little energy enforcing our own house rules because the community self-enforces and self-regulates. Because the reality is that, people who live with us are people who probably need a good night's rest on like a Tuesday night much more than we do, and because we've got the luxury of perhaps more resilience in terms of our day to day. And if we have a bad day at work tomorrow, it's probably not the end of the world. But for vulnerable households, which are the majority of people who live with us, getting a good night's rest and like knowing that your kids are safe in the building and these things are massively important. And once that's established, initially, then the community takes huge or derives huge value from that and essentially self-enforces it. So if I'm going to have like a bender on a Tuesday night, then it's very likely that my neighbor is going to sort me out way before our security guard downstairs has to get involved. So that is, yeah, definitely been our experience so far.
Thank you for taking that impromptu question. All right, I would like to open it up to the audience if we have any questions out here before we get to Zoom. Oh, okay. Plaid shirt. I'm going to have you stand up, say your name, and say your question loud. I'll try and repeat it. Also, for folks on Zoom, I don't know if we have another microphone. Do you want? Okay.
Cool. Hi, my name is Stefan. I'm a PhD student in urban planning. So my question is, I'm reminded a little bit of the developer Jonathan Liebman and Propertuity and Mabonang, which also was a very exciting splash on the scene, but the properties were liquidated en masse, right? How would you differentiate your approach from that approach? Maybe you learned some lessons from Propertuity that you're doing differently. And then maybe if you could speak to sort of the cultural politics of what living in the city means for residents, as well as just the economic aspect.
Sure. So from a business model point of view, we're quite different to Perpetuity. They were developing fairly high-end residential apartments by and large, kind of like typical urban, let's call it urban regeneration, to be kind, type like high-end apartments, and selling them off into the consumer market. And that, I guess business model ran into trouble, like they were highly leveraged and they were having cost overruns on the one end and not achieving their sellout rates on the other end, and basically had a squeeze and went bankrupt. so we build these buildings and hold them on balance sheet permanently. We don't sell them, and we rent them out. So for us, our kind of commercial viability is, does the rent that we're able to collect, net of expenses, service our cost of capital? And as long as that does, then we're viable. So it's a very different model, and because we typically work with pension capital and institutional investors, there's a lot more checks and balances built in that I think prevent effectively speculative development. So we're quite regulated, which I think serves us as much as that is the bane of my existence on many a Tuesday morning. But so that's your first question. On the cultural significance of living in the city, I'm not exactly sure what you referring to there, but I do think that, you know, it's very hard not to, like, in the context of South Africa, you know, the legacy of apartheid era spatial planning and spatial segregation along racial lines is so like ever present, still with us today, that it's very hard not to think, basically, to engage with what we do and think about basically spatial transformation. Really, at the end of the day, the reality is that 99% of people who live with us are Black, and their parents would not legally have been able to live here. So especially this project, right? This is in Sandton. It's really hard to stress the degree to which this blows people's mind, that basically, to put it super bluntly, poor Black people will be able to live in Sandton, right? It's just like totally unheard of. And even, you know, where we now, like almost 30 years into the dawn of democracy in South Africa, this is still surprising to people, right? So you know, I don't know if that speaks to what you were getting at, but I mean, I think that is a very big part of what we do, and the weight of this is not lost on us.
Had someone in the back, and then I'll get.
Thank you so much. I'm Hagen from South Korea. I would like to applaud your work in building such public housing. I think we have the same model, but in a larger scale in South Korea. Yeah. And what's happening is the social mix is not happening because of the very architecture of such buildings being like a fortress. Do you have anything in mind by design you can encourage more social mix in such settings?
Yeah, super relevant question. I mean, I'm familiar with the work in South Korea. It's amazing. So we do try and create a mix across the income spectrum through creating different sizes and types and basically pricing of units within our buildings. And then, but I do think that to be perfectly frank, it's less of a concern for us at the moment, because literally just by bringing this let's say target market into these areas spatially, there's such a transformative aspect to it already. So basically, you're taking someone who would have never been able to live in this area at all and providing them with an opportunity to live there, and that in itself is already quite you know, that is like where the most of the mixing is happening, basically. But it is something that we are thinking about and asking ourselves, like, how do we create further integration within our buildings? And yeah, it is top of mind. But other than creating different sizes of units and like trying to play across as broad an income spectrum as possible without going into like basically outpricing the affordable market, that's pretty much what we're doing at the moment.
Hi, my name is Etta Madete. I'm an architect developer from Kenya. I'm an affordable housing company that builds what we call multifamily housing, I discovered, or affordable housing in Kenya. We're at 137 units. So you at around 5,000, you're sort of, you're hitting the bar. So I think we need a much longer conversation on how you get there, because building housing in emerging markets is you know, battle. But I do have a question in terms of your funding structure and how you ensure, how you structure your funding such that there's, first of all, it doesn't restrict when it comes to, they don't restrict how you structure your development, but then they also give you patient capital. So I'm at the Harvard Graduate School of Design at the moment, doing the master in real estate. So this might be financy, but basically you're saying you're getting patient capital, pension fund capital. So they expect a certain amount of returns. And I'm wondering, do they then impose kind of restrictions on your the income that you're supposed to be getting on your property? Does that mean that over time you need to sort of control for rental growth? How does then, when you increase, when you don't have sort of like, when it's still a financial building, it's still a income producing property that has to meet certain returns, how then do you control, the market putting pressure on you to either increase your rents beyond what the people you're targeting can afford? So it's sort of like, how do you control for the social factors you're trying to hit, especially because your buildings look beautiful? Eventually someone in the middle class will be like, you know what, why not? And then they sort of create internal gentrification. And then also the second one is, I don't know how it is in other apartment buildings in South Africa, is sort of like, at some point, what is your density threshold that then it doesn't begin to deteriorate the quality of life? What's that maximum, do you think, in your experience? Thank you.
Cool. Very, very happy to chat further. I love Nairobi. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. So happy to exchange ideas. To start at the end, it's not rent capped at all. It's we charge what we can in the open market, and maybe like a little bit too much of a neoliberal in this respect, but I don't believe, I'm not aware of any example of rent control that's ever worked sustainably in any market anywhere in the world. So I do think that the way to keep housing affordable is to build loads of it, and that's what we need to do. So the funding model is, I think, to a degree, a function of the fact that we are lucky to have a well-developed debt capital market in South Africa. The difference between South Africa and Kenya is that our prime lending rate is about 10%, whereas yours is over 20%, right? So we're actually able to bring these projects online and service debt on them, whereas in Kenya, you can't develop at the yields required to service debt. So it's all equity, and then you've got a higher cost of capital on average, so it makes the projects harder to get off the ground. But there, I've got lots of ideas, but I'm not going to bore the entire audience with it now. So happy to chat with you offline. But yeah, you need to chat to the DFIs. Cool. And sorry, and I think 300 apartments is, in my mind, the limit for how many should be in a building. To your question on density.
What size?
In terms of dwelling units per hectare is how I would think about it. I'd say 400 dwelling units per hectare, 500 dwelling units per hectare. You can still get like really good urban form at that density.
So my name is Jaime. I'm also an investor in real estate at the at GSD. My background is in city planning, and I'm actually really interested in building affordable housing communities in Mexico. So it's kind of fascinating seeing how the development pattern in South Africa like mirrors what's happening right now in Mexico as well. So I have two questions. In comparison to the area's median income in the neighborhoods that you have developed projects, how are the rents priced in the properties that you're developing? So this sort of relates to the previous question. Can you specify which income segment of the population your affordable housing targets? And then also, can you provide a rough estimate as to the occupancy rates in your project as well? Like, what do you consider to be a success in measuring, I guess, the impact of the projects?
For us, full is 95, 96% occupancy. So like you'll have a certain amount of operational vacancy at all times. So like a couple of apartments are being renovated, or someone just moved out in the middle of the month and it's empty until the end of the month. So 95% is full, and that's how we value it. In terms of rental, so we basically charge as much as we can, frankly, but for a given product in a given market segment. But we build the way in which we make it affordable is we build really basically small, dense, units in well-located areas. Not doing a very good job at answering this. Okay, so who lives with us? Basically, the lowest wage earning formally employed people. So like if you've got a job basically working in retail and like you're like a cashier, you should be able to live with us in the area where you work, right? That's the desire. So our society is complex. We've got 40% unemployment, right? So if you don't earn an income, then you can't pay rent. It's kind of obvious. So there's a huge amount of South African society that is like by default excluded already. So we still have a huge need for public housing programs. And we actually, I mean, I speak about it today, but we also develop social housing, which is state subsidized. And there is and poor Alexia heard a lot about this from me. But it's a program that is way too small a portion of our total housing program. And it's something, it's basically what her and her clever colleagues would call demand side led interventions, where you're basically effectively subsidizing the end user and letting them decide where they want to live through social housing. So we have that, and that's growing. That's for people who earn some money, but typically in informal employment, but they still can't afford to live with us. Because at the end of the day, our cheapest rent is basically the cost of building the cheapest apartment that formal money can build, that is building code compliant, and basically dividing that cost by the cost of capital gives you the rent you need to charge. That's really like how we get to it. And that happens to be at the moment basically like the lowest wage earning portion of our society, essentially minimum wage earners. And then we play from that up quite a bit up the income spectrum by virtue of how our income distribution works in the country. So we basically go from, like, let's say the 10th percentile by earnings to like the 70th percentile, and then like basically who the middle class basically sits above us.
We'll take one question from over here, and then we'll jump to Zoom to see if we have questions. And then we'll go back to questions.
Thanks so much for being here. My name is Alice. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School in the MPA and International Development Program. I actually spent part of my summer in Johannesburg working with CAF, so I got a little taste of this. Cool. My question is around, I guess when we talk about affordable housing, we mostly talk about the rental market. And obviously in the South African context with apartheid, you know, a lot of Black and non-white families were prevented from owning homes. Mm-hmm. So kind of where does home ownership maybe fit into this conversation? Is it even a conversation being had? And then also, I guess, a second question, kind of talking about the spatial part there. You talked a little bit about commute costs and, you know, people kind of coming to the center of the city for work. Is there also talk about kind of reviving, or maybe not reviving, but creating vibrant ecosystems kind of in townships on the outskirts of the cities to kind of address the affordable housing kind of race to the center problem? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so we've definitely done, like, I'd say at least like six or seven of the 10 most like pertinent questions. So, and that was like 2 of the top 3, I think. So on home ownership, I mean, there is an insane amount of literature on like both for and against, right? So I don't think I'm qualified to say specifically, you know, which is correct, and it definitely is contextually specific. Like what is more appropriate, I think, is contextually specific, and even, you know, inter-household it differs. But I do think, like just by observation in the South African context, that there is way less access to affordable, well-located rental housing than there is, you know, housing that you can acquire. And I think, you know, I'll give you an interesting statistic. In South Africa, only 14% of households are nuclear family households, where it's mom, dad, and a kid, right? And single family homes as like a typology really have been designed and conceived of in the post-war era as something that is in suburbia and caters to mom, dad, and kid, or 2 kids. And that is like a household form that essentially doesn't exist in our context. And I think, I dare say, probably even here too. So basically, we've got a changing demographic profile of society, where you've got more single family households, a lot of single mothers. Basically, the largest single grouping of tenants in our buildings are single mothers. We've got over 50% of our tenants are female-headed households, not because we specifically favor them or, you know, cater to them or anything, but which is almost 3 times the national average for households. And it's because single mothers basically really value being in a good location, in a safe building, close to where the kids go to school. Surprise. Like, it's like not, you know, it's kind of like obvious. So the point I want to make is, you know, there is a real, I think, need for more flexible forms of housing tenure in a society that is majority non-traditional household structures. And because we have so little of that relative to our total housing stock, you know, my personal focus and emphasis is currently on rental housing because that's really where there's a massive need. And I think that rental housing and basically flexibility around 10 years is incredibly important. I'll just say one other thing on this. So the benefit of having a large portfolio, as we do with quite a spectrum of kind of, let's say, unit types and price points across the portfolio, is that in any given month, we do between 200 and 300 what we call arrangements, where we basically have, and we were losing a big cost of our business model is basically the cost of acquiring a new tenant. And we had this very high rate of churn where a lot of people would leave us all the time. So we started looking into that and doing a lot of exit surveying and figuring out like what's going on here. And we realized that often it's not that someone loses their entire income and they can't live with us anymore, but they actually just like have a family member who has lost their job and they need to like subsidize their income for a couple of months, or they've had some like temporary thing happen to them, which means that they can probably afford 70% of the rent that they could afford previously, but they definitely can't afford the unit they're in anymore. So what we've started doing now is by, and depending on the circumstance of the individual, either giving them a temporary rental rebate and perhaps a repayment plan to catch that up over time, or like a bit of a discount. We've got a foundation that for certain tenant groups, you know, would subsidize it, that actually came out of the pandemic. But then what we do a lot of is moving people within our portfolio. So we'll say like, okay, cool, you had a 2-bedroom unit, but you can only afford like a lesser rent now for a while. Let's move you to a 1-bedroom unit, like down the corridor for a couple of months. And like once you're back on your feet, we'll move you back into a 2-bedroom unit again. Now, this is the kind of flexibility that you get in rental housing that is very difficult to achieve in titled home ownership, where what ends up happening there is now you've had that same thing happen to you, but now the bank forecloses on your mortgage and your credit rating is fucked forever and you're out of a house. So basically, I definitely am more in favor of rental. Sorry.
Can we keep going with
Yeah.
questions here? Okay, excellent. Yes, you.
Thanks for speaking with us. My name is Emily Litzis. I'm an MPA student here, and I did an MBA. And I'm curious if you could return to the cost of development. How did you raise the capital needed to build these projects, buy the 7 city blocks in the June City, and then what kind of returns are you offering to your investors, and what's the timeline? Just to get a sense on how this could apply in a U.S. context, and like the threshold for the investment.
Nothing about the US housing market makes any sense to me. I should just start by saying that. So I don't know how any of it would apply. But so quite simply, we kind of try and deliver like high teen return on equities. So like over a holding period, it's mostly permanent capital. So guys think it's not exactly like an IRR to an exit, but that's kind of what we try and achieve, which is pretty much market related for real estate private equity in South Africa, which it has to be, right? Because we are raising capital from guys who are saying like, do I want to invest in that shopping center over there and make said return, or am I going to give it to these guys? So we have to be competitive in the local capital market. And so it's not like soft capital at all or like subsidized in any way. To answer your question though, we've been very lucky to have managed to get very established South African real estate partners who had great relationships with the capital market on board with the vision of what we're doing early on. And we effectively leveraged their reputation in the market with basically local banks and pension funds to raise cash. Is the simple answer. There's a much longer story, but I'll maybe tell you afterwards.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm Fernando Garcia. I'm a research fellow here at the lab, the Growth Lab. I think you talked about this a bit, but maybe I would like you to elaborate a little bit more. Why is it that there are not more people like you or like your firm that do this? like generally, both in South Africa, but maybe in other parts of the world?
I think that's a good question, and I don't actually entirely know. I think it's because it's easier to do the alternative. That's simply. And I think because it hasn't been convincingly demonstrated that this makes more money. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, true. Yeah. Yeah, so it's easier to build expensive stuff. Yeah, true.
Well, thank you all for joining today. We love these development talks, and we were glad that you're here. And thank you to you, Carl, for giving
Thank you,
us such
LaChaun.
a great experience when it comes to low-income housing and how we can really get this right. So with that, enjoy the rest of your day.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you.